The crimson sunset over Nevada's Carson Valley painted the desert sky like spilled blood across ancient canvas, casting long shadows over the town of Silver Creek, where Rebecca "Becca" Sullivan stood on the steps of the burned-out church, surveying the devastation that had transformed her thriving community into a graveyard of broken dreams and murdered hopes. The 45-year-old widow's weathered hands gripped a charred Bible as she studied the systematic destruction that could only have been orchestrated by someone who knew every weakness, every secret, every vulnerable point that made Silver Creek defensible or destroyable. 3 days had passed since the coordinated attack that had left 27 people dead. The bank robbed of everything that represented the community's future, and every major building either burned or blown apart with the precision of military engineering. But what haunted Becca more than the physical destruction was the growing certainty that this catastrophe had been enabled by someone she had trusted, someone who had lived among them and learned their secrets before selling those secrets to enemies who measured human worth in terms of profit and strategic advantage. Becca's steel-gray eyes, sharp as a cavalry saber and twice as dangerous when provoked, missed nothing as they catalogued the tactical precision of the assault that had destroyed her adopted home. Her raven-black hair, streaked with premature silver from grief and responsibility, was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the angular features of someone who had learned to command respect through intelligence and determination rather than feminine charm or male protection. The town around her bore the scars of violence that transcended mere robbery or random destruction. This had been systematic elimination, designed not just to steal Silver Creek's wealth, but to erase its very existence from the map of human settlement. Every building that had represented hope, progress, or community resistance to outside pressure had been specifically targeted and destroyed, with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what each structure meant to the people who had built their lives around it. "Miss Sullivan," came a voice behind her, soft with the Irish accent of County Cork and heavy with the weight of shared loss. Father Michael O'Brien emerged from the ruins of what had been his rectory, his black cassock torn and stained with soot, but his eyes still burning with the righteous anger of someone who had watched evil triumph through treachery rather than honest strength. "Father O'Brien," Becca replied, without turning from her survey of the destruction, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who had moved beyond grief to something far more dangerous. "Have you found any trace of how they knew where to strike? How they bypassed our sentries, our defenses, our escape routes?" The priest's weathered face reflected the same terrible understanding that was growing in Becca's mind. The attack was too precise, too well coordinated. They knew which buildings housed our emergency supplies, which families had hidden valuables, even which routes our children would use to flee to the desert hideouts. Someone told them. Becca. Someone we trusted. The confirmation of treachery hit Becca like a physical blow, but it also clarified the nature of the task that lay ahead of her. This wasn't just about rebuilding Silver Creek or seeking justice for the dead. It was about identifying and destroying an enemy who had lived among them, shared their meals, participated in their councils, and planned their destruction with the calculating patience of a spider weaving its web. "Father," Becca said quietly, "I need you to gather everyone who survived, everyone who can walk, talk, and think clearly. We're going to conduct an investigation that would make a federal marshal proud, and by the time we're finished, we'll know exactly who sold us to our enemies and why." as the priest moved to implement her orders. Becca allowed herself a moment of private grief for the community that had been her refuge since her husband's death 5 years earlier. Silver Creek had been more than just a mining town. It had been an experiment in democratic cooperation, where Irish miners, Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, and displaced Civil War veterans had created something unique in the American West, a community that thrived on inclusion rather than exclusion, cooperation rather than competition. But that very cooperation had also created vulnerabilities that their enemies had exploited with devastating effectiveness. The trust that had made Silver Creek strong had also made it brittle, and someone had shattered that trust like glass struck by a hammer. Becca's hand moved unconsciously to the silver locket at her throat, feeling the weight of the photograph it contained, not of her deceased husband Thomas, as most people assumed, but of her brother James, whose death at the Battle of Antietam had shaped every decision she had made for the past 15 years. What the people of Silver Creek didn't know was that Rebecca Sullivan was not just a widow who had found refuge in their community. She was Rebecca McMahon, sister of Colonel James McMahon, whose intelligence network had been one of the Union Army's most effective weapons against Confederate espionage. The skills that had made James legendary among military intelligence officers lived on in his sister, who had learned to read people, situations, and strategic possibilities with the deadly precision of someone trained to detect deception in all its forms. Those skills had been dormant during her years of peaceful life in Silver Creek, but the destruction of her adopted community had awakened them with a vengeance that would shake the Nevada Territory to its foundations. As survivors began gathering in the ruins of the town square, Becca studied each face with the systematic assessment that James had taught her during their years of working together before the war separated them forever. Maria Gonzalez, whose husband had died defending the bank. Chen Wei, whose general store had been looted down to the last nail. Samuel Porter, the telegraph operator whose equipment had been destroyed before he could send word of the attack to territorial authorities. But most importantly, she studied the faces of those who had been conspicuously absent during the attack, or who had suffered suspiciously light casualties, despite being in positions that should have made them primary targets. Treachery left traces for those who knew how to read them, and Becca was beginning to see patterns that filled her with cold rage and calculating determination. "My friends," she addressed the assembled survivors, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her calling in the leadership that crisis demanded. 3 days ago, our community was destroyed by enemies who knew our secrets, our defenses, and our vulnerabilities. This level of tactical knowledge could only have come from someone who lived among us and betrayed us to forces that saw our cooperation as a threat to their vision of Western development. A murmur of angry understanding rippled through the crowd as people began to grasp the implications of what she was suggesting. The attack on Silver Creek hadn't been random violence or opportunistic robbery. It had been a coordinated assassination of a community that had proven that different peoples could work together successfully, despite the prejudices and conflicts that characterized most frontier settlements. "Mrs. Sullivan," called out Maria Gonzalez, her voice trembling with grief and rage. "Are you saying that one of us, one of our neighbors, our friends, sold us out to murderers?" Becca's answer came not in words, but in the production of evidence that she had been gathering since the morning after the attack. Fragments of paper, partially burned telegraph messages, and most damaging of all, a leather pouch containing gold coins that bore the distinctive markings of the Comstock Mining Syndicate, the corporate entity that had been trying to acquire Silver Creek's mineral rights for the past 2 years. "Someone in our community has been taking money from the Comstock Syndicate," Becca announced, holding up the evidence for all to see. "Someone has been reporting our activities, our decisions, our defensive preparations to enemies who wanted us destroyed. And someone is going to answer for 27 innocent lives and the destruction of everything we built together." The revelation sent shock waves through the assembled survivors, but it also galvanized them around the promise of justice and the hope of revenge against those who had betrayed their trust. Becca saw the moment when grief transformed into determination, when despair became the foundation for resistance that would not stop until every traitor and every enemy had paid the full price for their crimes. "My friends," Becca continued, her voice growing stronger as she felt the community's resolve crystallizing around her leadership. "I make you this promise. I will identify the traitor who sold us to our enemies. I will track down every person responsible for this attack, and I will ensure that justice finds its level, like water seeking low ground, regardless of how powerful our enemies think themselves or how well-connected our betrayer believes himself to be." The oath was witnessed by 43 survivors whose lives had been shattered by treachery, but who now had a leader whose skills and determination offered the possibility of redemption through vengeance. What they didn't yet know was that Rebecca Sullivan carried knowledge and connections that reached far beyond anything their enemies had anticipated when they planned the destruction of Silver Creek. As the desert night settled over the ruins of their community, the survivors began the work of investigation and preparation that would transform them from victims into instruments of justice. But in the shadows beyond the firelight, eyes watched their gathering with the cold calculation of someone who had successfully orchestrated their destruction once and was prepared to do so again if they proved resilient enough to threaten his carefully laid plans. The traitor among them was still there, still watching, still reporting to masters who measured success in terms of eliminated obstacles rather than preserved lives. But Rebecca Sullivan was no longer the simple widow he had helped to target. She was becoming something far more dangerous, and her oath of vengeance would echo through the Nevada territory like thunder, promising storms that would wash away every trace of corruption and betrayal. The Judas among them was about to discover that some secrets, once awakened, were more deadly than any amount of gold or corporate protection, and some women carried weapons that no traitor could anticipate or defend against. Hey everyone, the stakes are already incredibly high here in Silver Creek. 27 people dead, an entire community destroyed, and now Becca's discovery that someone they trusted sold them out to their enemies. This is the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any bullet. That oath of vengeance she just made has me on the edge of my seat. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Becca's transformation from grieving widow to vengeful leader. And if you're already hooked on this tale of betrayal and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The pale light of dawn crept across the Nevada desert like hope struggling against despair, illuminating the ruins of Silver Creek, where Rebecca Sullivan sat in what remained of the schoolhouse, surrounded by documents and evidence that painted a picture of systematic betrayal more complex and damning than even she had initially suspected. The night had been spent in careful investigation, using skills that James McMahon had taught his sister during their covert operations against Confederate intelligence networks during the darkest days of the Civil War Becca's weathered fingers traced the edges of partially burned correspondence that revealed a conspiracy reaching far beyond the simple sale of tactical information to corporate raiders. The letters, written in a hand she was beginning to recognize with growing horror. Detailed plans that encompassed not just the destruction of Silver Creek, but the systematic elimination of every cooperative community that threatened corporate control of Western development. Mrs. Sullivan, Father O'Brien's voice called softly from the doorway, his Irish accent carrying the weight of someone who had spent the night administering last rites to the dying and comfort to the bereaved. The survivors are gathering as you requested, but Becca, there's something else you need to know. The priest's expression held the kind of terrible knowledge that came from hearing confessions and keeping secrets that could destroy lives or save souls. He carried a small wooden box that Becca recognized with a chill of foreboding, the container where Silver Creek's most sensitive documents had been stored, supposedly secure from any threat except direct assault on the town hall. "Father," Becca said with growing dread, "please tell me that box wasn't compromised during the attack." O'Brien's silence was answer enough as he placed the box on the table beside Becca's other evidence. The lock had been carefully opened rather than smashed, and the contents had been sorted through by someone who knew exactly what to look for and what to leave behind as misdirection. "Whoever opened this box had a key," the priest said quietly. "More than that, they knew which documents were most valuable and which were simply administrative records. Becca, this level of access could only come from someone who held an official position in our community government." The revelation sent ice through Becca's veins as she began to understand the true scope of the betrayal they faced. The traitor wasn't just someone who had sold tactical information to their enemies. He was someone who had been entrusted with the community's most sensitive secrets. Someone whose position had given him access to everything that made Silver Creek vulnerable or valuable. "Father," Becca said with dangerous quiet, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to answer honestly regardless of any confidences you might feel obligated to protect. During the past 6 months, has anyone in our community leadership approached you about concerns regarding Silver Creek's future, questions about whether our cooperation with different ethnic groups was wise, suggestions that maybe we were attracting the wrong kind of attention from territorial authorities?" The priest's face reflected the internal struggle of someone caught between pastoral confidentiality and the demands of justice for the dead. Finally, his commitment to the living overcame his professional obligations. "Becca," he said carefully, "there have been conversations. Someone has been questioning whether our inclusive policies were sustainable in the long term, whether we might be better served by more conventional approaches to territorial development." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the import of what Father O'Brien was revealing. Someone in Silver Creek's leadership had been preparing the ground for betrayal by spreading doubts about the very principles that had made their community successful, softening resistance to the idea that cooperation with outside forces might be necessary for survival. Who, Becca asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Before Father O'Brien could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to riders moving across the desert toward the ruins of Silver Creek. But these weren't survivors returning from refuge in the mountains. They moved with the purposeful coordination of a military patrol, and their leader carried a flag that marked them as territorial militia rather than corporate raiders or random travelers. "Becca," the priest said with relief evident in his voice. "It looks like help has finally arrived. Federal authorities must have learned about the attack." But Becca's trained eye noted details that filled her with suspicion rather than relief. The patrol was too small for a genuine rescue mission, too well equipped for a simple investigation. And most disturbing of all, their timing suggested advanced knowledge of when they would find Silver Creek defenseless and vulnerable. "Father," she said quietly, "gather our people and be ready to scatter if I give the signal. I don't think these are the kind of territorial authorities we want to trust with our secrets." As the patrol approached the ruins of the town hall, Becca emerged from the schoolhouse with the bearing of someone who had nothing to hide, but was prepared to defend everything she held dear. The militia leader was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of military bearing that spoke of professional soldiers rather than territorial volunteers. "Ma'am," the leader called out as he dismounted. "Colonel Marcus Blackwood, commanding the 3rd Territorial Militia. We received reports of Indian attacks in this area and came to investigate." The lie was smooth and professional, but Becca's intelligence training allowed her to read the subtle signs that marked Blackwood as someone who was not what he appeared to be. His equipment was too expensive for territorial militia. His men moved with the coordination of professional soldiers, and most damning of all, his eyes showed no surprise at the scope of destruction that should have shocked any honest investigator. "Colonel Blackwood," Becca replied with careful neutrality. "I'm Rebecca Sullivan, one of the survivors of the attack on Silver Creek. I'm afraid your information is incorrect. This wasn't an Indian raid. We were attacked by a coordinated force of corporate mercenaries acting on intelligence provided by someone within our own community." Blackwood's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as he absorbed the implications of what she had revealed. If the survivors had identified the attack as corporate-sponsored rather than random Indian violence, his mission would be far more complex than simple intimidation or elimination of witnesses. "Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwood said with forced sympathy, "I can understand how the trauma of such an attack might lead to misinterpretations of what actually occurred. Frontier violence often seems more organized than it really is, especially to civilians who aren't familiar with military tactics." The condescending tone was designed to discredit her observations while establishing his authority as someone qualified to determine what had actually happened. But Becca had dealt with arrogant military officers before, and she knew how to turn their assumptions against them. "Colonel," she said with deceptive meekness, "perhaps you could help me understand something that's been puzzling me. The attackers seem to know exactly which buildings contained our emergency supplies, which families had hidden valuables, and which escape routes our children would use to reach safety. How would random raiders have acquired such detailed tactical knowledge?" The question was a trap, designed to force Blackwood into either admitting that the attack was more sophisticated than his cover story suggested, or revealing knowledge that he shouldn't possess if he was genuinely investigating random violence. Blackwood's hesitation was brief but telling, as he realized that he was dealing with someone whose intelligence exceeded his expectations. "Mrs. Sullivan, experienced raiders often conduct reconnaissance before attacking frontier settlements. What might seem like inside knowledge could simply be the result of careful observation." But even as he provided the explanation, Blackwood was studying the ruins of Silver Creek with professional interest that betrayed familiarity with the tactical objectives that had guided the destruction. His eyes lingered on specific buildings, noted the precision of the demolition work, and most tellingly, showed no surprise at discoveries that should have been shocking to someone learning about the attack for the first time. "Colonel Blackwood," came a new voice from behind them, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command in dangerous situations. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The speaker was a man Becca recognized with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Captain David Morrison, a federal marshal whose reputation for honesty and competence had made him legendary throughout the Nevada Territory. Morrison's arrival complicated the tactical situation dramatically, forcing Blackwood to maintain his cover while dealing with federal authority that might expose his true mission. "Captain Morrison," Blackwood replied with professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide his displeasure at the federal intervention. "Colonel Marcus Blackwood, 3rd Territorial Militia. We're investigating reports of Indian raids in this district." Morrison's experienced eye swept across the ruins of Silver Creek with the systematic assessment of someone who had investigated frontier violence for 15 years. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen through Blackwood's deception immediately. "Colonel, I've been tracking Indian movements throughout this territory for the past 6 months. There haven't been any hostile activities within 200 miles of Silver Creek. What happened here was the work of professional soldiers, not random raiders." The federal marshal's assessment confirmed everything that Becca had concluded about the attack, but it also placed Blackwood in an impossible position. He could no longer maintain his cover story without directly contradicting federal authority, but abandoning it would expose his true mission and the interests he represented. "Captain Morrison," Becca said before Blackwood could respond, "perhaps you could examine some evidence we've gathered regarding the attack. I think you'll find it quite illuminating." As she led Morrison toward the schoolhouse where her investigation materials were stored, Becca noticed that one of Blackwood's men was positioning himself to observe their conversation, while another seemed to be signaling toward the desert, where additional forces might be concealed. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she realized that the arrival of federal authority might have triggered a desperate attempt to eliminate all witnesses to the truth about Silver Creek's destruction. "Captain," she said quietly as they walked, "I believe Colonel Blackwood and his men are not what they appear to be. More importantly, I believe they're here to complete the work that the original attackers began." Morrison's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his weapon as he grasped the implications of what she was suggesting. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you certain about this assessment?" Becca's answer came not in words, but in the production of evidence that would shock even a federal marshal accustomed to frontier corruption and violence. Hidden among her investigation materials were documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against Silver Creek correspondents, proving that territorial militia units had been infiltrated by corporate interests. Financial records showing payments to military officers for intelligence and tactical support. And most damning of all, operational plans that detailed the systematic elimination of cooperative communities throughout the Nevada Territory. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison breathed as he examined evidence that exposed corruption reaching from local mining companies to territorial military command. "Mrs. Sullivan, this evidence, it proves that what happened to Silver Creek was part of a coordinated campaign to eliminate communities that threatened corporate control of Western development." The revelation transformed Morrison's understanding of what they were facing, but it also placed both of them in immediate mortal danger. If Blackwood was indeed part of the conspiracy that had destroyed Silver Creek, his mission here was not investigation, but elimination of witnesses who could expose the true scope of corporate involvement in territorial violence. "Captain Morrison," Becca said with the calm precision of someone who had faced death before and was prepared to face it again. I think we're about to discover whether federal law enforcement can protect honest citizens from territorial corruption, or whether we're going to have to protect ourselves. As if summoned by her words, the sound of weapons being cocked echoed across the ruins of Silver Creek, confirming that their enemies had decided that negotiation was no longer possible and that elimination was the only viable option for protecting the conspiracy that had already claimed 27 innocent lives. The shadows of the past were about to become the reality of the present, and Rebecca Sullivan was about to discover whether the skills James McMahon had taught her were sufficient to protect not just her own life, but the truth that could expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. The oath of vengeance she had sworn was about to be tested by enemies who believed that murder was a reasonable business expense and that witnesses were simply obstacles to be removed when they became inconvenient. The tension in the ruins of Silver Creek stretched taut as piano wire as Captain Morrison and Becca Sullivan found themselves surrounded by men whose militia uniforms couldn't disguise their true nature as corporate enforcers masquerading as territorial authority. Colonel Blackwood's facade of official concern had dissolved completely, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who had been sent to eliminate the last obstacles to a conspiracy that reached from Nevada mining companies to the territorial capital itself. "Captain Morrison," Blackwood said with dangerous courtesy, "I'm afraid you've stumbled into a situation that requires careful handling by territorial authorities. Federal interference would be counterproductive to the resolution of local problems." Morrison's hand rested on his weapon with the casual readiness of someone who had faced corrupt officials before and understood that federal authority meant nothing to men who were willing to murder witnesses to protect their crimes. "Colonel, I have jurisdiction over any crimes that cross territorial boundaries or involve federal interests. The destruction of a postal facility and telegraph station makes this a federal matter." The legal maneuvering was a dance around the violence that all participants knew was inevitable, but it also provided Becca with crucial intelligence about the scope of the conspiracy she was facing. Blackwood's confidence suggested resources and connections that extended far beyond simple corporate intimidation, while Morrison's presence meant that federal authorities were beginning to investigate territorial corruption on a systematic basis. "Miss Sullivan," Blackwood said, turning his attention to the real threat in their midst. "I understand you've been conducting some sort of investigation into the unfortunate events that befell your community. Perhaps you'd be willing to share your findings with territorial authorities who are better equipped to pursue appropriate justice." The request was a trap designed to determine what evidence she possessed while positioning Blackwood to eliminate both her and Morrison before they could expose the truth about Silver Creek's destruction. But Becca had learned from James McMahon that the most dangerous weapon in any intelligence operation was an enemy's assumption that they controlled the situation. "Colonel Blackwood," she replied with deceptive cooperation, "I'd be delighted to share what we've discovered. But first, perhaps you could help me understand something that's been puzzling me. How did you know to find us here?" "We haven't had functioning telegraph equipment since the attack, and the territorial capital is 3 days hard riding from Silver Creek." The question exposed a logical impossibility in Blackwood's cover story, forcing him to either admit advanced knowledge of their location or provide explanations that would further undermine his credibility. Morrison noticed the inconsistency immediately, his experienced eye cataloging additional details that marked Blackwood's force as something other than legitimate territorial militia. Mrs. Sullivan, Blackwood said with forced patience. Territorial authorities maintain regular patrols throughout the mining districts. We received reports of the attack from other sources. But even as he provided the evasion, Blackwood was positioning his men for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. His original mission had been to eliminate any survivors who might possess dangerous knowledge. But the arrival of federal authority had complicated his tactical situation beyond the point where subtlety remained possible. "Colonel," Morrison said quietly, "I think it's time for you to identify these other sources and explain why territorial militia is operating with equipment that appears to be federal military issue." The federal marshal's observation was devastating in its accuracy. Blackwood's men carried weapons and gear that were far superior to anything available to territorial volunteers, suggesting connections to federal military supply networks or corporate sponsors with access to professional military equipment. "Captain Morrison," came a new voice from the edge of the ruins, carrying the musical accent of County Cork and the authority of someone who had spent the night gathering information that would reshape everyone's understanding of the situation they faced. Father O'Brien emerged from concealment with a dozen survivors whose faces reflected the grim satisfaction of people who had discovered the identity of their betrayer. "Father O'Brien," Becca said without taking her eyes off Blackwood, "I trust your evening's work was productive." The priest's smile was cold as winter wind across the Sierra Nevada. Indeed it was. "Rebecca, we found our Judas, and we found evidence that will interest Captain Morrison considerably." As the survivors spread out to surround Blackwood's force, they revealed a man whose hands were bound and whose face reflected the terror of someone who understood that his carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed. Becca recognized him with a mixture of rage and satisfaction. Deputy Town Marshal William Hayes, the man who had been entrusted with Silver Creek's security and who had used that trust to orchestrate the community's destruction. "Hayes," Morrison said with disgust, "I should have known. You've been under federal investigation for corruption in 3 territories." The revelation that Hayes was a known criminal whose activities had attracted federal attention added another layer to the conspiracy that had destroyed Silver Creek. This wasn't just local corruption or random corporate violence. It was part of a systematic pattern of territorial subversion that threatened the foundations of democratic governance throughout the American West. "Marshal Hayes," Becca said with dangerous quiet, "I believe you have some explaining to do. 27 people died because of your betrayal, and I think the survivors deserve to understand why their trust was worth so little to you." Hayes's response was to break into the kind of desperate confession that came from someone who understood that his only hope for survival lay in revealing everything he knew about the conspiracy that had employed him. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said with pathetic desperation, "you have to understand, they offered me more money than I could make in 10 years as a territorial marshal. All I had to do was provide information about Silver Creek's defenses and residents. I never thought they would actually kill anyone." The excuse was as weak as it was self-serving, but it also provided crucial intelligence about the scope of the conspiracy. If Hayes was just one of many territorial officials being bribed by corporate interests, the threat to democratic governance was far larger than even Becca had imagined. "Hayes," Morrison said with the authority of federal law enforcement, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government. But right now, I'm more interested in who paid you and what other territorial officials are involved in this conspiracy. as Hayes began revealing details that would expose corruption reaching from local mining companies to the territorial governor's office. Blackwood realized that his mission had failed completely, and that his only remaining option was the kind of violence that would eliminate all witnesses regardless of the consequences. "Enough," Blackwood said with finality, drawing his weapon in a motion that signaled his men to abandon any pretense of official authority. "Captain Morrison, Mrs. Sullivan, you've learned more than is healthy for federal officials or curious widows. This conversation ends now." But even as Blackwood moved to implement the final solution that would protect his employers from exposure, he discovered that Rebecca Sullivan had been preparing for exactly this moment since the night her community was destroyed. The widow, who had seemed so vulnerable and isolated, was revealed to be someone whose strategic planning and tactical preparation rivaled anything his professional military experience had encountered. "Colonel Blackwood," Becca said with calm confidence that chilled his blood, "I think you're about to discover that some widows are more dangerous than you imagined, and some oaths of vengeance carry more weight than corporate gold or territorial authority." The signal she gave was subtle, but unmistakable to those who had been waiting for it. Throughout the ruins of Silver Creek, concealed positions erupted with the coordinated firepower of defenders who had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this confrontation. The survivors, who had seemed so helpless and scattered, were revealed to be a disciplined force whose tactical coordination would have impressed military officers from both sides of the Civil War. More importantly, Becca's preparation had included allies whose arrival would transform the tactical situation completely. Federal marshals emerged from concealment positions throughout the valley, their weapons trained on Blackwood's force with the authority of United States law enforcement. The trap that the colonel thought he was springing had actually been set by someone whose understanding of military intelligence far exceeded his own. "Colonel Blackwood," came a voice that carried the authority of high federal office. "This is United States Marshal Samuel Crawford, acting under direct orders from the Department of Justice. You and your men are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and impersonating federal military personnel." The arrival of federal authority and overwhelming force marked the end of Blackwood's mission and the beginning of a reckoning that would expose territorial corruption throughout the Nevada Territory. But for Becca Sullivan, it was also the culmination of 3 days of careful investigation and strategic planning that had transformed her from a victim seeking justice into an instrument of federal law enforcement, whose work would reshape territorial governance for decades to come. The spider's web of conspiracy that had destroyed Silver Creek was finally being unraveled, thread by thread, revealing connections that reached from corporate boardrooms to territorial capitals and exposed the systematic subversion of democratic governance that threatened the entire American frontier. But the most important revelation was yet to come, the disclosure of Becca's true identity and the skills that had made her such a formidable opponent for enemies who thought they were dealing with a simple frontier widow, rather than someone whose intelligence training had been forged in the crucible of Civil War espionage. The oath of vengeance she had sworn was about to be fulfilled in ways that her enemies could never have anticipated. And the truth about Silver Creek's destruction was about to emerge with the devastating power of revelation that would echo through territorial politics for generations to come. Folks, this is absolutely explosive. Hayes confessing to being the traitor, Blackwood's militia being exposed as corporate mercenaries. And now we're seeing that Becca had this whole thing planned from the beginning. She's been playing chess, while her enemies were playing checkers, and that hint about federal marshals already being in position. Our widow clearly has some serious connections and skills that nobody saw coming. What do you think her real background is? Drop your theories in the comments. And if you're as riveted as I am by this masterclass in strategic planning, smash that subscribe button. The desert wind carried the acrid scent of gun smoke, and the weight of secrets finally revealed as Rebecca Sullivan stood among the captured members of Blackwood's conspiracy, her steel-gray eyes holding the cold satisfaction of someone whose carefully planned vengeance was finally reaching its intended target. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come, one that would transform everyone's understanding of who Rebecca Sullivan really was and why her oath of vengeance carried the authority of federal law enforcement rather than simple frontier justice. "Marshal Crawford," Becca said with an authority that surprised even Captain Morrison, "I believe it's time to complete the identification of everyone involved in this conspiracy. Colonel Blackwood and Deputy Hayes are just foot soldiers in an organization that reaches much higher than territorial corruption." Crawford's weathered face reflected the respect due to someone whose intelligence work had been essential to the federal investigation that culminated in today's arrests. "Mrs. Sullivan, or should I say, Agent McMahon, the Department of Justice is grateful for your assistance in exposing this conspiracy. Your brother's training served you well." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt, confirming suspicions that some had harbored about Rebecca's unusual competence, while shocking others who had never imagined that their quiet neighbor was actually a federal intelligence operative whose skills had been honed during the most dangerous covert operations of the Civil War. "Agent McMahon," Morrison repeated with growing understanding of why Rebecca had seemed so familiar with intelligence gathering and tactical planning. "You're Colonel James McMahon's sister, the McMahon who ran Union intelligence operations behind Confederate lines." Becca nodded, her hand moving to the silver locket at her throat, where James's photograph had provided strength and guidance during the years since his death at Antietam. "Captain Morrison, my brother taught me everything he knew about reading people, detecting deception, and gathering intelligence that could expose enemies who hid behind legitimate authority. When I came to Silver Creek 5 years ago, I thought I was leaving that life behind forever." Father O'Brien crossed himself as he absorbed the implications of what he was learning about the woman who had become the heart of their community's resistance. "Becca, you mean you've been working for the federal government all this time?" "Not actively," she clarified, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had tried to escape a violent past, but found herself drawn back into service when justice demanded it. "I came to Silver Creek to live quietly as Thomas Sullivan's widow and to forget the skills that James died teaching me. But when our community was destroyed by corporate conspiracy and territorial corruption, I contacted federal authorities who had been investigating similar attacks throughout the Western Territories." The scope of what she was revealing transformed everyone's understanding of recent events. Silver Creek's destruction hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate communities that threatened corporate control of Western development. More importantly, Rebecca's investigation had been coordinated with federal authorities whose jurisdiction extended far beyond territorial boundaries. "Mrs. Sullivan," Blackwood said with the desperate cunning of someone seeking any advantage in an impossible situation, "you're admitting to federal espionage against territorial authorities. That's treason under territorial law." Rebecca's laugh was soft, but carried undertones that made everyone present suddenly uncomfortable. "Colonel Blackwood, I think you're confused about which of us is guilty of treason. Territorial law derives its authority from federal oversight, not from corporate sponsorship or criminal conspiracy. Marshal Crawford stepped forward with documentation that would complete the exposure of the conspiracy that had destroyed Silver Creek and threatened democratic governance throughout the Nevada Territory. Colonel Blackwood, or should I say Marcus Sinclair, you're not a territorial militia officer at all. You're a corporate enforcer whose real employers have been systematically subverting territorial authority for their own profit. The revelation of Blackwood's true identity sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, confirming that the corruption they faced was even more sophisticated and dangerous than they had imagined. The man who had presented himself as legitimate military authority was actually a professional criminal, whose mission was the elimination of obstacles to corporate expansion. Agent McMahon, Crawford continued, using Rebecca's professional designation with the respect due to someone whose intelligence work had been essential to federal investigation. Your infiltration of this conspiracy and identification of its territorial connections has provided the Department of Justice with evidence we need to clean house from the local level to the territorial capital. Rebecca felt the complex emotions that came with finally revealing her true identity after 5 years of living quietly as a frontier widow. The skills that James had died teaching her were no longer dormant. They had become weapons in a war between democratic governance and corporate tyranny that would determine the future of the American West. "Marshal Crawford," she said with professional precision, "the evidence we've gathered here proves that territorial officials have been taking bribes to facilitate the destruction of communities that threatened corporate interests. But more importantly, it reveals that this conspiracy includes federal officials who were supposed to provide oversight of territorial governance. The implication that corruption reached into federal authority itself sent visible tremors through everyone present, including Crawford and Morrison, who understood that their own institutions might be compromised by the same corporate influences that had corrupted territorial government. "Agent McMahon," Morrison said carefully, "exactly how high does this conspiracy reach?" Rebecca's answer came in the form of additional evidence that she had been gathering since the night Silver Creek was destroyed, correspondence that revealed the true scope of corporate influence over Western territorial policy, letters from Washington officials, financial records showing payments to federal judges, and most damning of all, operational plans that detailed the systematic elimination of democratic communities throughout multiple territories. "Gentlemen," she said, as federal marshals examined evidence that would reshape their understanding of territorial corruption, what we've exposed here is not just local criminal activity. It's a coordinated attempt to transform territorial governance into corporate colonialism, with Eastern business interests controlling Western development through bought officials and eliminated opposition. Father O'Brien studied the evidence with the growing horror of someone who understood that the attack on Silver Creek was part of something much larger and more systematic than local violence. "Rebecca, you're saying that our community was destroyed because we proved that different peoples could work together successfully, because we threatened the idea that the West should be controlled by corporate interests rather than democratic cooperation." "Exactly," Rebecca confirmed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years documenting the systematic subversion of American democracy. Silver Creek represented everything that corporate interests feared, most proof that territorial development could be based on inclusion rather than exclusion, cooperation rather than conquest, democratic participation rather than corporate control. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Marcus Sinclair made one final desperate attempt to complete his mission through the kind of violence that had served corporate interests throughout his professional career. But he discovered that Rebecca McMahon had been anticipating exactly such a move since the moment she first suspected his true identity. "Agent McMahon," Sinclair snarled as he drew his weapon in a motion designed to eliminate the primary threat to his employer's interests. "You may have federal backing, but you're still just one woman against forces that control territorial development from California to Colorado." Rebecca's response demonstrated why James McMahon had considered his sister the most naturally gifted intelligence operative he had ever trained. Her Navy Colt appeared in her hand with inhuman speed, its barrel steady as she aimed at the corporate enforcer whose arrogance had finally overridden his tactical judgment. "Mr. Sinclair," she said with deadly calm, "you're about to discover that some women carry weapons you never learned to recognize. Truth, justice, and the absolute refusal to let good people die for corporate profit. Those are weapons that no amount of money can buy or corruption can defeat." The gunshot that echoed across the ruins of Silver Creek was like a judgment pronounced by the desert itself, marking the end of Sinclair's career and the beginning of a reckoning that would expose corporate conspiracy throughout the American West. As the man who had orchestrated the destruction of her community fell dead in the Nevada dust, Rebecca felt the complex satisfaction that came from honoring both her oath of vengeance and her commitment to federal justice. "Father O'Brien," she said, as federal marshals secured the remaining prisoners and began the process of documentation that would reshape territorial law enforcement. "I owe you and our community an apology for deceiving you about my true identity, but I hope you understand that some secrets are kept not to deceive friends, but to protect them from enemies who might use that knowledge to cause harm." The priest's smile reflected the understanding of someone who had spent years hearing confessions and keeping secrets that could destroy lives or save souls. "Rebecca, or Agent McMahon, or whoever you choose to be, you saved our community and exposed corruption that threatened every honest family in the territory. Your deception was in service of truth, and that makes it virtuous rather than sinful." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the Nevada sky in familiar shades of crimson and gold, Rebecca McMahon stood among the evidence that would transform territorial governance throughout the Southwest. The oath of vengeance she had sworn had been fulfilled. But more importantly, the principles that James had died defending had been vindicated through her courage and skill. "Agent McMahon," Marshal Crawford said, as federal authorities prepared to transport prisoners and evidence to the territorial capital for trials that would reshape Western politics. "The Department of Justice would like you to consider a permanent position coordinating intelligence operations against corporate subversion of territorial democracy. Your work here has proven that federal oversight is essential to protecting democratic governance from corporate tyranny." Rebecca considered the offer carefully, weighing her desire for a quiet life against her recognition that some responsibilities transcended personal preferences. Silver Creek could be rebuilt, but only if the forces that had destroyed it were permanently neutralized through ongoing vigilance and federal oversight. "Marshal Crawford," she said finally, "my brother used to say that some fights are worth having regardless of the personal cost. I think the fight for democratic governance in the American West is one of those fights that each generation must take up in its own way." The acceptance of federal authority represented the completion of Rebecca's transformation from a widow seeking personal vengeance, to a federal agent whose work would protect countless communities from the kind of corporate violence that had destroyed Silver Creek. But it also meant embracing a public life that would make her a target for every corporate interest that profited from territorial corruption. As the sun set over the ruins of Silver Creek, Rebecca McMahon prepared to begin a new chapter in her life as a federal intelligence operative, whose mission was to ensure that democratic governance would survive the corporate assault on territorial authority that threatened the foundations of American civilization in the West. The traitor who had destroyed her town was dead. The conspiracy that had enabled his treachery was exposed, and the oath of vengeance she had sworn had been fulfilled through federal justice rather than personal revenge. But most importantly, the principles for which her brother had died were now embodied in federal policy that would protect future generations from the corporate tyranny that had nearly succeeded in subverting territorial democracy. The colonel's sister had finally claimed her inheritance, not of property or wealth, but of responsibility for defending the democratic principles that made America worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost or the corporate enemies who would seek to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The territorial courtroom in Carson City buzzed with tension thick as summer heat as Rebecca McMahon, now publicly acknowledged as a federal intelligence agent, concluded her testimony in the most comprehensive corruption trial in Nevada Territory's history. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in Silver Creek's ruins, and the evidence she had gathered was systematically destroying the network of corporate influence that had corrupted territorial governance from the county level to the governor's office. Judge William Parker, a federal appointee whose integrity was matched only by his understanding of the complex legal precedents that Rebecca's investigation had established, studied the documentation that covered his bench like a roadmap of systematic corruption, financial records, correspondence between corporate executives and territorial officials, and most damning of all, operational plans that detailed the elimination of democratic communities throughout the American West. Agent McMahon, Judge Parker said, with the respect due to someone whose courage had exposed conspiracy reaching from Nevada mining companies to Washington, D.C. Your investigation has revealed systematic violations of federal law that demand immediate corrective action. The evidence you've presented proves that territorial officials conspired with corporate interests to subvert democratic governance through bribery, intimidation, and murder. Rebecca accepted the judge's assessment with the professional satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed one of the most complex intelligence operations in federal law enforcement history. But she also understood that legal victory was only the beginning of a larger campaign to restore democratic governance to territories that had been corrupted by corporate gold and corporate violence. Your Honor, Rebecca replied, the conspiracy we've exposed here represents more than local corruption or random criminal activity. It was a systematic attempt to transform territorial governance into corporate colonialism, with Eastern business interests controlling Western development through purchased officials and eliminated opposition. As she spoke, Rebecca's eyes swept across the packed courtroom where the survivors of Silver Creek sat alongside newspaper correspondents, territorial officials, and federal investigators who understood that the precedents being established here would reshape American governance throughout the frontier. Among them sat Father O'Brien, Maria Gonzalez, Chen Wei, and the other community members whose courage had made this moment of justice possible. But her attention was particularly drawn to a section reserved for the families of those who had died defending Silver Creek 27 graves that represented the human cost of corporate greed and territorial corruption. Their presence reminded her that legal justice, however satisfying, could never fully compensate for lives lost to conspiracy and betrayal. Agent McMahon, came a voice from the defense table, carrying the desperate arrogance of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Territorial Governor Harrison Blackwell, whose arrest had sent shock waves through Western political circles, was making a final attempt to discredit evidence that would end his career and probably result in federal imprisonment. "Governor Blackwell," Judge Parker said with icy authority, "you'll have an opportunity to present your defense when appropriate. Agent McMahon's testimony is not yet complete." The formal rebuke silenced Blackwell temporarily, but Rebecca could see in his eyes the calculation of someone who still believed that wealth and political connections could overcome federal justice. It was a delusion that many corrupt officials shared until they discovered that some crimes were too well documented and too publicly exposed to be dismissed through traditional political maneuvering. "Your Honor," Rebecca continued, "I want to present one final piece of evidence that illustrates the true scope of the conspiracy we've exposed." She withdrew from her coat a leather portfolio that had been recovered from Marcus Sinclair's body after their confrontation in Silver Creek documents that revealed the existence of similar operations in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and California. The conspiracy to eliminate democratic communities was not limited to Nevada, but represented a coordinated assault on territorial governance throughout the American West. This portfolio contains operational plans for the destruction of 17 communities that threatened corporate control of Western development. Rebecca explained, as Judge Parker examined documents that would trigger federal investigations across multiple territories. Silver Creek was just one target in a systematic campaign to eliminate any settlement that proved democratic cooperation was possible, despite ethnic, religious, or cultural differences. The revelation sent a murmur through the courtroom as people began to grasp the true scope of what Rebecca had uncovered. This wasn't just about one destroyed town or one corrupt territorial government. It was about the future of American democracy in regions where corporate power threatened to overwhelm citizen participation in governance. "Agent McMahon," Judge Parker said with growing understanding of the historical significance of the trial he was presiding over, "are you testifying that corporate interests were attempting to prevent democratic development throughout the Western territories or Sepulveda?" "Exactly. Your Honor," Rebecca confirmed. "The evidence shows that Eastern corporate interests viewed territorial democracy as a threat to their plans for resource extraction and economic control. Communities like Silver Creek proved that ordinary citizens could work together successfully without corporate management or ethnic segregation. And that proof had to be eliminated to maintain the fiction that corporate control was necessary for Western development." As Rebecca completed her testimony and prepared to step down from the witness stand, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a widow seeking personal vengeance to a federal agent whose work was reshaping the relationship between corporate power and democratic governance throughout the American frontier. The oath of vengeance she had sworn over the ruins of Silver Creek had been fulfilled in ways that transcended personal satisfaction. The traitor who had betrayed her community was dead. The officials who had enabled his treachery were facing federal prosecution. And most importantly, the conspiracy that had threatened territorial democracy was being systematically dismantled through federal investigation and legal action. "Agent McMahon," came a voice from the gallery, carrying the Irish accent of County Cork and the authority of someone who had witnessed the power of truth to overcome corruption. Father O'Brien stood among the Silver Creek survivors, his presence representing not just their individual quest for justice, but their collective commitment to rebuilding their community on foundations stronger than those that corporate conspiracy had tried to destroy. "Father O'Brien," Rebecca replied, with the warmth of friendship that had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle against overwhelming odds. "Thank you for your testimony and for your leadership during the darkest days of our community's trial." As the legal proceedings continued, with the presentation of additional evidence and the examination of witnesses whose testimony would complete the destruction of territorial corruption, Rebecca found herself thinking about the future that lay ahead for both herself and the survivors of Silver Creek. The federal position that Marshal Crawford had offered would require her to coordinate intelligence operations against corporate subversion throughout the Western Territories, a responsibility that would make her a permanent target for every business interest that profited from territorial corruption. But it would also give her the authority and resources to prevent other communities from suffering Silver Creek's fate. "Agent McMahon," Judge Parker announced as the day's proceedings drew to a close. "The court thanks you for your testimony and your service to federal justice. Your investigation has provided the legal foundation for reforms that will protect territorial democracy for generations to come." The formal recognition was gratifying, but Rebecca understood that her real reward lay in the knowledge that James McMahon's sacrifice during the Civil War had finally been vindicated through her work to preserve the democratic principles he had died defending. The intelligence skills he had taught her had indeed served federal justice, ensuring that corporate tyranny would not replace democratic governance in the American West. As the sun set over Carson City, painting the Nevada sky in familiar shades of crimson and gold, Rebecca McMahon prepared for the next phase of her career as a federal intelligence agent whose mission was to protect territorial democracy from the corporate forces that viewed citizen participation as an obstacle to profitable resource extraction. The blood of Silver Creek's defenders had been answered by justice, and the gold that had corrupted territorial officials had been exposed to federal oversight that would prevent future conspiracies from subverting democratic governance. But most importantly, the oath of vengeance she had sworn had been transformed into something larger and more enduring, a commitment to federal service that would protect countless communities from the corporate violence that had nearly succeeded in destroying the foundations of American democracy in the West. The traitor who had destroyed her town was dead, but the principles for which her community had died were alive and embodied in federal policy that would guide territorial development for decades to come. Truth had indeed found its level, like water seeking low ground, and in finding that level, it had carved new channels through which justice could flow to every corner of the American frontier. This is absolutely incredible. Folks, the way Rebecca's personal quest for vengeance has transformed into a federal campaign for justice throughout the entire American West is just breathtaking. That revelation about 17 other communities being targeted shows this was never just about Silver Creek. It was about the very soul of American democracy on the frontier. What do you think about Rebecca's decision to become a permanent federal agent? Is she making the right choice? Let me know in the comments. And if this epic tale of corruption exposed and justice served has you as amazed as I am, hit that subscribe button. 6 months after the federal trials that transformed territorial governance throughout the American West, Rebecca McMahon stood on the hill overlooking the rebuilt town of Silver Creek, watching as construction crews completed work on the new school that would educate children from every ethnic community that had made their valley home. The sight of walls rising from foundations built on principles of inclusion rather than corporate control provided visible proof that democratic ideals could indeed survive the assault of organized corruption and systematic violence. As the newly appointed federal coordinator for territorial intelligence, Rebecca had spent the intervening months traveling throughout Nevada, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, implementing the reforms that her investigation had made possible. Every corrupt official exposed, every corporate conspiracy disrupted, every democratic community protected represented a victory over the forces that had tried to transform the American frontier into a corporate colony where citizen participation was subordinated to business profit. Agent McMahon, came a familiar voice from behind her, warm with the satisfaction of shared accomplishment and enduring friendship. Catherine Wells, now serving as the federal territorial surveyor, approached with reports that would complete the transformation of Western resource management from corporate manipulation to scientific oversight and democratic accountability. Catherine, Rebecca replied, turning from her contemplation of the rebuilt community to greet her colleague and friend. I trust the geological surveys are proceeding according to plan. Wells smiled with the enthusiasm of someone whose scientific work was finally serving democratic ideals rather than corporate exploitation. Better than we dared hope, Rebecca. The comprehensive surveys we've conducted throughout the territories prove that resource scarcity has been artificially created by corporate hoarding rather than natural limitation. There's enough water, minerals, and agricultural potential to support millions of settlers if resources are managed scientifically rather than monopolistically. The confirmation that corporate claims about Western scarcity had been fraudulent provided the final vindication of everything Rebecca and her allies had fought to expose. The destruction of Silver Creek had been motivated not by legitimate resource competition, but by the corporate fear that successful democratic communities would inspire others to resist corporate control of territorial development. As they discussed the broader implications of their success, both women noticed riders approaching the rebuilt town from the direction of Carson City, not the corporate mercenaries or corrupt officials who had once threatened their work, but federal marshals and territorial administrators whose presence suggested important news from the ongoing campaign against corporate subversion of democratic governance. Leading the delegation was Marshal Samuel Crawford, whose dogged pursuit of territorial corruption had made him a hero throughout the West and a model for federal law enforcement in regions where local authority had been compromised by corporate influence. Behind him rode newly elected territorial governor Maria Santos, the first Hispanic woman to hold executive authority in Nevada territory, and a reformer whose election had been made possible by the exposure of her corrupt predecessors. Agent McMahon, Governor Santos called out as they approached the overlook where Rebecca and Catherine were meeting. I have news from Washington that I think you'll find both gratifying and challenging. The President has signed legislation establishing a permanent Federal Bureau of Democratic Protection with authority to investigate and prevent corporate subversion of citizen governance throughout all Western territories and states. The announcement was momentous, representing the culmination of everything Rebecca had worked toward since the night Silver Creek was destroyed. Federal oversight of corporate influence and territorial governance would prevent future conspiracies while ensuring that Western development served the needs of democratic society rather than concentrated wealth. Governor Santos, Rebecca replied, I'm honored that federal authorities, have chosen to implement the reforms that so many good people died to make possible. But you mentioned that the news was also challenging. Marshall Crawford stepped forward with the expression of someone delivering an offer that could reshape a person's entire life. Agent McMahon, the President has nominated you to serve as the first director of the Federal Bureau of Democratic Protection. The position would require you to oversee federal protection of citizen governance from the territorial capitals to Washington, D.C. The offer was both thrilling and sobering, representing an opportunity to ensure that the principles Silver Creek had died defending would guide federal policy for generations to come, while also requiring her to accept a level of public responsibility that would make her a permanent target for every corporate interest that profited from territorial corruption. Marshall Crawford, Rebecca said carefully, the work we've done here in Nevada is far from complete. Silver Creek is just one example of what democratic cooperation can accomplish. But there are dozens of other communities throughout the territories that need similar protection from corporate predation. Catherine Wells stepped forward with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her calling in the intersection of science and public service. Rebecca, that's exactly why you should accept the nomination. The reforms we've implemented here can serve as a model for the entire American West, but only if someone with your knowledge and experience guides their implementation at the federal level. As Rebecca considered the momentous decision before her, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a widow seeking vengeance for her community's destruction to a federal nominee whose work would shape the future of American democracy. The transformation had been painful, requiring her to embrace public responsibility that made privacy impossible, but it had also been profoundly meaningful. Governor Santos, Rebecca said finally, before I can accept such a responsibility, I need to know that the federal government is truly committed to the principles that guided my brother's service and my own investigation's scientific integrity, democratic oversight, and the belief that government should serve the needs of all citizens rather than concentrated corporate interests. Governor Santos's smile reflected the conviction of someone who had witnessed the power of honest government to transform society. Agent McMahon, the legislation establishing the Federal Bureau of Democratic Protection specifically requires that all territorial oversight decisions be based on citizen welfare rather than corporate considerations. More importantly, it mandates democratic participation through territorial legislatures and federal review. The assurance addressed Rebecca's deepest concerns about accepting federal authority that might be subject to the same corporate corruption that had infected territorial governance. If the new bureau operated according to the principles James had died defending, it could indeed serve as a permanent bulwark against the concentration of American governance in corporate hands. There's one more thing, Marshall Crawford added with obvious satisfaction. The federal trials of the territorial officials and corporate executives involved in the Silver Creek conspiracy concluded last week. 47 people received federal prison sentences, including former territorial governors and corporate executives who thought their wealth and connections made them untouchable. The news provided final vindication for the oath of vengeance Rebecca had sworn over the graves of Silver Creek's defenders. Justice had indeed found its level, carrying away the human obstacles that had tried to block its flow while establishing legal precedents that would protect future generations from similar corporate violence. Marshall Crawford, Rebecca said with quiet satisfaction. My brother always believed that some truths are too important to be suppressed by political expedience or corporate intimidation. I'm gratified that federal justice has proven him correct. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the Nevada sky in the familiar shades of crimson and gold that had marked so many crucial moments in Rebecca's journey toward justice. She made the decision that would define her legacy and complete James McMahon's work. "Governor Santos," she said, with the authority of someone who had found her calling in the service of democratic principles, "I accept the nomination to serve as director of the Federal Bureau of Democratic Protection, but I want it understood that this bureau will operate according to the principles my brother died, defending scientific integrity, democratic oversight, and the belief that government is a public trust rather than corporate property." The acceptance speech was witnessed not just by federal officials and territorial administrators, but by the families throughout Silver Creek, whose lives had been transformed by the exposure of corruption and the implementation of honest governance. Father O'Brien and his parishioners, Maria Gonzalez and her children, Chen Wei and his extended family, all were present to witness the moment when local justice became federal policy. As the sun set over the rebuilt valley, Rebecca McMahon prepared to leave Nevada territory for Washington, D.C., where she would begin the work of ensuring that democratic governance would survive the corporate assault on citizen participation that threatened the foundations of American civilization. The oath of vengeance she had sworn over Silver Creek's ruins had been fulfilled in ways that transcended personal satisfaction or even community justice. The traitor who had destroyed her town was dead. The officials who had enabled his treachery had been prosecuted. And most importantly, the conspiracy that had threatened territorial democracy was being permanently dismantled through federal oversight and legal reform. Rebecca's journey from defending a single community to directing federal protection of democratic governance represented more than personal triumph. It embodied the principle that American democracy could indeed reform itself when citizens had the courage to expose corruption and demand accountability from those who wielded power. The desert that had once been stained with the blood of Silver Creek's defenders now bloomed with the promise of honest development, while the principles that guided that transformation spread throughout the American West like seeds carried by wind, taking root wherever they found soil prepared by citizens who refused to let corporate power overwhelm democratic participation. Rebecca McMahon, Federal Director of Democratic Protection and guardian of her brother's vision, prepared to begin a new chapter in the ongoing story of American democracy. Secure in the knowledge that some oaths were indeed powerful enough to reshape the very foundations of government, and some principles were too important to be compromised by temporary obstacles or temporary enemies. The traitor who had destroyed her town was dead, but the ideals for which her community had died were alive and embodied in federal policy that would guide American governance for generations to come. Truth had found its level, like water seeking low ground, and in finding that level, it had carved new channels through which justice could flow to every corner of the Republic that James and Rebecca McMahon had served with such distinction and sacrifice. The crimson sunset faded to purple twilight as Rebecca completed her final survey of the rebuilt Silver Creek, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new enemies, but also new opportunities to defend the democratic principles that made America worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost or the corporate forces that sought to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The oath of vengeance had been fulfilled, but more importantly, it had been transformed into something larger and more enduring, a commitment to federal service that would protect the democratic ideals for which good people had died and ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten or rendered meaningless by the march of corporate ambition. Well, my friends, what an absolutely incredible journey we've taken together through the ruins and rebirth of Silver Creek. Rebecca McMahon's transformation from a widow seeking vengeance to the Director of Federal Democratic Protection is one of the most inspiring stories of personal courage, creating systemic change that I've ever had the privilege to share with you. The way her oath of vengeance evolved from personal justice to federal policy shows us that sometimes the most profound victories are won not through violence, but through the patient exposure of truth and the unwavering commitment to democratic ideals. Her brother James would have been so proud to see how his intelligence training ultimately served to protect the very principles he died defending during the Civil War. Where are you watching from as we conclude this epic tale of betrayal, investigation, and ultimate justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Rebecca balanced personal loss with public service, and whether you think her choice to accept federal responsibility was the right one for both her personally and for American democracy. Drop your reflections in the comments below. If this story of territorial corruption, federal justice, and the power of democratic ideals to overcome corporate tyranny has inspired you as much as it has inspired me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I've got more amazing tales of frontier justice, democratic courage, and the eternal struggle between citizen governance and concentrated power coming your way. Remember, folks, sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with guns and violence, but with investigation and evidence, courage and principle, community solidarity, and federal oversight. Rebecca McMahon proved that ordinary citizens armed with truth and determination can indeed reshape the very foundations of government when justice demands action and democracy requires protection. Thanks for joining me in the rebuilt streets and federal courtrooms, where American democracy was tested, challenged, and ultimately strengthened by people who understood that some principles are worth defending, regardless of the personal cost or the corporate enemies who seek to destroy them. Until next time, keep seeking the truth, keep demanding accountability from those in power, and never forget that in America, the people really can reform their government when they have the courage to expose corruption and the wisdom to work together for the common good. The oath of vengeance can indeed become the foundation for justice, and truth really does find its level, like water seeking low ground.